I am joined now by the Deputy Majority Leader of the State Senate, Michael Gianaris, represents a district in Queens. We wanted to get his reaction to the resignation, which of course was announced earlier today. Thanks for joining us, Senator. What is your reaction? Were you surprised this morning?
I'm probably surprised by the timing. We all thought he was going to stick this out, although it was later than it should have been. A lot of us have been seeking that resignation since the spring, but at least it spares us the next couple of months of dealing with the governor who's trying to cling to power while he's being held accountable.
You were prepared, I take it, to form, and you'd be the highest ranking senator on a court of impeachment, which is what our Constitution specifies should happen if the governor gets impeached.
Yeah, that's our obligation in the Senate. If the Assembly were to or still may impeach, the Senate will have a trial 30 days after the impeachment articles are delivered to us. So that's something that we were prepared to do. And I suppose if the Assembly sees fit to continue forward, we remain prepared to do.
Yeah, what is your sense of that? As we mentioned before, there are penalties other than removal that follow an impeachment for fact-finding purposes, as well as to perhaps mete out one of those punishments. It's entirely possible that the legislature might proceed, right?
Yeah, I certainly don't want to sit and tell the Assembly what they should do here. That's up to them, but it is possible that they can either continue forward and produce a report with what their investigation found, go ahead and vote impeachment articles, or decide that the resignation is enough and not go forward. That's up to them. But should they go ahead and impeach and deliver article says, we will certainly have the trial that's required.
Does New York State need either legislation or some other kind of guidelines to be put in place so that, the next time something like this comes up, we don't have to go back to 1913 and try to imagine what the procedures ought to look like?
Well, much of this is laid out in the Constitution, and amending the Constitution is a laborious process. It takes two separately elected legislatures to pass something and put it on the ballot for referendum. So it's usually a minimum of 3 to 4 years before you can try and change the constitutions. Whether we need to do that now, right now, it's a lot of deference to the legislature. The standards are not particularly clear. And I would say this, though, in this circumstance, it worked to the benefit of New Yorkers. The Assembly was moving forward. They had a lot of deference in what decision they could make, and I think the governor, realizing he didn't have a lot of grounds to challenge their actions, led to his swifter resignation than many of us expected.
Interesting. So you think it was the threat of impeachment that led him to today's resignation?
I think so. I think he realized there's no path forward for him. He basically said that in his own remarks, that he didn't want to go through the next couple of months and put New York through this process. And so I think had he really thought there was a way through this, he probably would have pursued it. But a lot of the doors were closed to him in terms of options.
Well, as an attorney, maybe you can explain this. I mean, he said there'd be a lot of litigation and so forth. I'm not entirely sure that that's the case, right? I mean, anybody can get into court, but the trick is to stay there, right? I mean, the Constitution seemed pretty clear that the Assembly can impeach, and they could do it along the timetable that you just suggested. I'm trying to imagine a court stepping in and telling them that they don't have that power for some reason.
That's exactly right, Aaron. If you look for parallels in the federal impeachment process, the Supreme Court has basically said that there's a question whether the judiciary branch even has any jurisdiction to hear these cases, because it's a critical issue relative to the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branch. Here in New York, the impeachment court even includes the members of the highest court. So how could 7 of the 69 members of the impeachment court then have a separate judgment over whether what we did was appropriate or not? So I don't really think there's a lot of opportunities for judicial review in the impeachment process in New York.
Overall, Senator, where do you think this administration went wrong? Where did the governor go wrong? How did we get to this place?
In a word, tyranny. The governor was ham-handed. He was a bully by all accounts, and in some ways he was able to push through issues that he wanted when maybe it would have been more difficult. But in most instances, he created a government of one, and he rolled over the legislature and the Senate. He kept his own party out of power for 8 years. We had to fight through that, as you well know, for most of the last decade to finally beat back the IDC and then the Republicans and obtain our supermajority, which has led to some of the most productive legislative achievements in the history of New York State. So I watched him ticking off and saying in his remarks that we have the most progressive state in the nation. I want to say you're welcome, because that wasn't his choice. He would have preferred the Republicans in charge of the Senate, and he did have that for much of the last decade. But it's that kind of behavior where a lack of respect for the checks and balances for the other branches of government that made governing much more difficult.
What's your sense of what the remainder of this term will look like under Governor Hochul once she is sworn in?
Well, I think we're all anxious to get the state moving again. There's a number of things that have been frozen in place over the last couple of months because of the scandal. We have a very substantial rent relief program, over $2 billion, that hasn't gone out the door. We're last in the nation in getting that money out because of the distractions. There's the HERO Act that I got passed. Requires DOH to certify that we're in the midst of a pandemic so that protections in the workplace can be put in place. And somehow our Department of Health hasn't seen fit to certify that we're in the midst of a pandemic when everybody knows that we are. There's a number of things like that that have been on hold that we need to get moving again. So I think we're all committed in the legislature to working with Kathy Hochul. There's a year and 4 months left in this term. We want to just get things moving back in the right direction and make sure New York is functioning the way it's supposed to.
As is the case in other legislatures, she is, I guess, the nominal convener and chair of the state Senate. Does she normally show up for sessions? Is she a familiar figure on your side of the Capitol?
She is. I mean, we all know her even beyond her role as presiding officer, but she has presided particularly at the openings of session. She presided when we swore in the first female leader, legislative leader in the state's history, when Andrea Stewart-Cousins was elected as our Senate leader. So she has been there frequently. She is a familiar face. She was just here in Astoria a few weeks ago meeting with me about this exact possibility that today might arrive, and she wanted to get my thoughts about how to prepare for that moment. So, look, I think it's hard to have a worse relationship between the legislature and executive than was the case. So I think Kathy Hochul can only move things in the right direction. We're anxious to work with her cooperatively. What
would your advice be, or what would be your words and thoughts for members of the Cuomo administration who were part of a problematic workplace? Let's just agree on that, to describe it that way. What would you tell them they ought to do if they still want to continue to serve the public?
That's a good question. When you end up working for someone who is a bad actor, you got to question whether you're in the right place. And I think ultimately you folks were talking about that just a few minutes ago. I know that some people just decided it wasn't for them and they stepped out and got on with their lives. Those that remained will have to account for their part in this if, in fact, they had knowledge and were involved in some of these actions. And for those that were just innocent bystanders, I feel sorry for them, and I guess they'll just have to do their best to move on.
Okay. We're going to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll catch up with you as we go through this transition period over the next few weeks. Senator Gianaris, thanks for joining us.